April 6, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the sky turned black, not with storm clouds, but with aircraft. 355 Japanese planes, the largest single kamikaze attack in history, descended on the American fleet like a swarm of mechanical hornets. Each pilot had already written his final letters home. Each had tied his ceremonial hakimaki headband around his helmet. Each believed his plane, loaded with explosives, would pierce American steel and turn the tide of the war. What they didn't know was that waiting for them below was a revolution in naval warfare, a technology so advanced, so devastatingly effective, that it would transform their suicide missions from acts of terrifying effectiveness into exercises in mechanical slaughter. Hidden behind the grey steel plating of American destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were weapons the Japanese had never encountered in combat. The Mark 37 Director, connected to radar systems that could track aircraft through clouds, darkness, and smoke. And most critically, the Mark 12 and Mark 22, fire control computers, mechanical brains that could calculate lead, elevation, and firing solutions faster than any human gunner could dream of achieving. The Japanese kamikaze doctrine had been born out of desperation, but it was rooted in cold tactical logic. By late 1944, Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots. American fighters dominated the skies. Japanese aircraft, even when flown perfectly, struggled to land bombs on maneuvering warships. But a plane used as a guided missile, piloted by a determined man willing to die, could theoretically guarantee a hit. The math was simple and brutal: one plane, one pilot, one bomb, one ship damaged or destroyed. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, kamikaze attacks sank the escort carrier USS St. Lo and damaged dozens of other vessels. At Lingayen Gulf in January 1945, kamikazes damaged 40 ships and killed hundreds of sailors. The tactic seemed unstoppable. American gunners, relying on manual fire control, struggled to hit fast-moving aircraft diving from multiple angles. By the time a gun crew spotted a kamikaze, calculated its speed and trajectory, and trained their weapons, the plane was often already crashing into the deck. But American naval engineers had been working on a solution since 1942. The result was an integrated fire control system that married three revolutionary technologies. First, the SC and SK air search radars that could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 40 miles. Second, the Mark 4 and Mark 12 fire control radars that could lock onto individual targets and track them through evasive maneuvers. Third, the analog computers that processed radar data and output precise firing solutions to the gun mounts in real time. The Mark 37 gun director sat high on the superstructure of American warships, a distinctive rounded housing that looked almost comical compared to the aggressive lines of the guns below. Inside that housing was a radar dish, optical rangefinders, and mechanical computers. When radar detected an incoming aircraft, the director would lock on, tracking the target's range, bearing, altitude, and speed. This data fed into the Mark 1 a computer, a mechanical marvel of gears, cams and differentials that weighed over 2 tons. The computer didn't just calculate where the target was, it calculated where the target would be when the shells arrived. It factored in the velocity of the shells, the rotation of the Earth, wind resistance, even the temperature of the air. It adjusted for the ship's own movement, roll and pitch, and it did all of this continuously, updating firing solutions 30 times per second. The output of these calculations went directly to the gun mounts. 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft. With radar fire control, these guns could fire at targets they couldn't even see, punching shells through clouds, smoke, and darkness with lethal accuracy. The guns could fire 15 rounds per minute per barrel. Twin mounts meant 30 rounds per minute. A destroyer typically carried 5 twin mounts. That was 150 rounds per minute of radar-directed firepower. But the most devastating weapon in the American arsenal wasn't the 5-inch guns. It was the proximity fuse, a technology so secret that its existence was classified above the Manhattan Project. The VT fuse, as it was designated, contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver. When the shell approached an aircraft, The reflected signal triggered detonation, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel. A gunner no longer needed a direct hit. Getting within 70 feet was enough. The combination of radar fire control and proximity fuses transformed anti-aircraft gunnery from an art into a science of destruction. Pre-war studies estimated that it took an average of 2,500 rounds of conventional anti-aircraft fire to down a single enemy plane. With radar control and proximity fuses, that number dropped to under 300 rounds. Against kamikaze aircraft, diving in predictable straight lines, the kill rate was even higher. The Japanese had no idea this technology existed. Their intelligence services had completely failed to detect or understand the revolution occurring in American fire control. Japanese pilots still trained to approach from sun angles, to use clouds for cover, to jink and weave during their final runs. These tactics had worked against manual fire control. Against radar-guided weapons, they were worse than useless. The first massive test came on April 6, 1945, during Operation Kikusui No. 1. Kikusui meant floating chrysanthemum, a poetic name for a campaign of mass suicide. The Japanese High Command planned 10 waves of massed kamikaze attacks, each involving hundreds of aircraft. The goal was to destroy enough American ships to make the invasion of Japan impossibly costly. The American radar operators detected the first wave while it was still over Kyushu, 70 miles away. Combat information centers across the fleet lit up with contacts. The air search radars painted the incoming aircraft as bright blips on cathode ray screens. Fighter directors vectored combat air patrols toward the threats. But many planes slipped through the fighter screen. That's when the surface ships took over. At ranges exceeding 20 miles, the Mark 37 directors began tracking individual targets. The mechanical computers spun to life, gears meshing, cams turning, calculating firing solutions. Gun crews loaded shells with proximity fuses. Gunners didn't aim. The radar did that. They simply waited for the order to fire. The Japanese pilots diving toward their targets suddenly found themselves flying through walls of exploding steel. 5-inch shells detonated around them, filling the air with shrapnel. They couldn't see the radar beams tracking them. They couldn't hear the mechanical computers calculating their deaths. They only knew that the sky had become a meat grinder. A Mitsubishi Zero, piloted by a 20-year-old flight officer who had trained for only 3 months, dove toward the destroyer USS Lutzer. The pilot held his course steady, hands white-knuckled on the stick, certain that his sacrifice would sink the American vessel. He never saw the radar lock onto his aircraft. The Mark 37 director tracked him through his entire dive. When he reached 4,000 feet, the guns opened fire. The first proximity fuse shell detonated 60 feet from his starboard wing. The explosion shredded his control surfaces and tore off his landing gear. The second shell exploded directly beneath his fuselage, ripping the belly of the aircraft open. The third shell hit the engine, and the Zero disintegrated in midair, spreading burning wreckage across 100 yards of ocean. The pilot never made it within 1,000 yards of his target. His death had purchased nothing. The Lotz's guns were already tracking the next target before his wreckage hit the water. This scene repeated itself across the fleet, hundreds of times. Japanese pilots dove with courage and determination, only to be torn apart by weapons they couldn't see, directed by technology they didn't understand. The kamikaze tactic, which had seemed so devastating just months before, was being systematically defeated by mathematics and electronics. Of the 355 Japanese aircraft that attacked on April 6, American forces destroyed more than 300. Some fell to fighters. Most died under the guns of the radar-directed anti-aircraft systems. The kamikazes did manage to hit several ships. The destroyer Bush and Calhoun were sunk, and the battleship Maryland was damaged. But the exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan. 10 planes lost for every ship damaged, 20 planes for every ship sunk. The Japanese couldn't sustain those losses, but they had committed to the kamikaze campaign. Over the following weeks, Kikusui attacks continued. Each wave followed the same pattern. Hundreds of aircraft would launch from bases in Kyushu and Formosa. American radar would detect them at extreme range. Combat air patrols would intercept the formations, shooting down dozens before they reached the fleet. The survivors would press on, diving toward their targets, only to fly into a storm of radar-directed fire. By Kikasui No. 4 on April 16, Japanese pilots began reporting the impossibility of their missions. They described streams of shells that seemed to follow them through the sky. They spoke of explosions that occurred even when no ship was shooting at them, as if the shells were exploding on their own. Some pilots concluded that Americans had developed a new type of weapon. They were right, but they didn't understand what it was. Japanese naval intelligence intercepted American radio traffic and noticed references to VT fuses. They had no idea what VT meant: variable time, velocity tracking. The true meaning, variable timing radar proximity fuse, remained beyond their comprehension. Even if they had understood, they had no technological capability to replicate it. Japanese radar technology lagged years behind American development. Their fire control systems were still primarily optical. The integration of radar, computers and gunnery that made the American system so deadly was simply beyond Japanese industrial capacity in 1945. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. During the Okinawa campaign, the Japanese launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties. They sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. On the surface, those numbers seem devastating, but examine them more closely. 1,900 aircraft sacrificed to sink 36 ships. That's a ratio of 53 planes per ship sunk. For every ship destroyed, 10 more were damaged but returned to service. More importantly, the vast majority of kamikaze aircraft never reached their targets. American fighters and radar-directed anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 70% of attacking planes before they could crash into anything. The kamikaze pilots, sold on the idea that their sacrifice guaranteed results, were dying in droves without landing a single hit. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating. Kamikaze volunteers had been told they would strike like lightning too fast for American gunners to react. Instead, they watched their squadrons disintegrate in mid-air, torn apart by invisible forces. The few pilots who survived aborted missions reported that American fire control had achieved an almost supernatural level of accuracy. One Japanese flight commander, who survived 3 Kikasui missions before finally dying during the 4th, wrote in his final letter that the Americans had mastered a type of gunnery that seemed to see the future. His words were more accurate than he knew. The Mark I, a computer, was, in a very real sense, predicting the future position of his aircraft and firing at where he would be, not where he was. The radar-directed guns proved their worth in another crucial way: night kamikaze attacks. The Japanese, recognizing that daylight attacks were becoming suicidal, began launching aircraft at dusk and after dark. In World War I and even early World War II, night attacks by aircraft had been nearly impossible to defend against. Gunners couldn't see the targets, couldn't track them, couldn't calculate firing solutions. But American radar saw through darkness as clearly as daylight. The Mark IV fire control radar could lock onto aircraft at night, in storms, through smoke screens. Japanese pilots flying night missions discovered that darkness provided no protection. The radar found them. The computers calculated their positions. The proximity-fused shells tore them apart, all without a single American gunner laying eyes on the target. During the night attack of April 12, 37 Japanese aircraft approached the fleet under cover of darkness. The pilots believed they would achieve complete surprise. Instead, radar detected them at 30 miles. By the time they reached the fleet, coordinated fire from a dozen ships had created an aerial minefield of exploding shells. 28 aircraft were destroyed before reaching attack range. Of the 9 that broke through, 8 were shot down during their dives. One plane managed to crash into a transport, killing 11 sailors. 28 planes destroyed, and the one successful hit was against a lightly defended auxiliary vessel. The technological superiority of the American fire control system extended beyond just the hardware. The American approach to naval gunnery was fundamentally different from Japanese doctrine. Japan had emphasized individual skill, marksmanship, and the spirit of the gunner. American doctrine emphasized systems, integration, and technology multiplying human capability. A Japanese anti-aircraft gun crew consisted of highly trained men who manually tracked targets, calculated lead, and fired based on experience and instinct. An American gun crew consisted of technicians who monitored equipment, loaded shells, and executed firing solutions calculated by machines. The American system was faster, more accurate, and more reliable. It didn't matter if the gunner was tired, stressed, or inexperienced. The computer did the thinking. This philosophical difference extended to training. Japanese gunners trained for years to develop the instinct and skill needed for effective anti-aircraft fire. American gunners trained for weeks to operate their equipment properly. When casualties occurred, Japanese crews lost irreplaceable expertise. American crews could be replaced and made effective with minimal training because the machines carried the knowledge. By May 1945, as Kikasui attacks continued with diminishing returns, the Japanese military began to understand the magnitude of their technological disadvantage. Internal documents captured after the war reveal staff officers calculating that kamikaze tactics were no longer cost-effective. The loss rate had become unsustainable. Young pilots were dying by the hundreds. Aircraft were being expended faster than factories could replace them, and American ships continued to operate off Okinawa. But the attacks continued anyway. Japanese military doctrine had no mechanism to admit failure. The concept of kamikaze had become so central to the defense strategy that abandoning it would mean acknowledging that Japan had no path to victory. So the missions continued, sending young men to die in aircraft that were obsolete, using tactics that had been defeated by technology, against weapons they could not counter. The final Kikasui attack, number 10, launched on June 22, 1945. By this point, Japan was scraping the bottom of the barrel for aircraft and pilots. The attacking force consisted of only 45 planes, many of them obsolete trainers and reconnaissance aircraft pressed into kamikaze service. American radar detected them. American fighters intercepted them. American guns destroyed them. 3 planes managed to hit targets, damaging 2 destroyers. 42 aircraft were destroyed. The exchange ratio had become nearly worthless from Japan's perspective. When the war ended in August 1945, captured Japanese documents revealed plans for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. The plan called for 10,000 kamikaze aircraft to attack the American invasion fleet. Japanese strategists believed this massive sacrifice would sink enough ships to break the American will to continue the war. They were wrong. American naval forces had already destroyed over 4,000 kamikaze aircraft during the Okinawa campaign. The radar-directed fire control systems had proven they could handle mass attacks. The proximity fuse had turned every shell into a potential kill. The integration of radar, computers and guns had created an anti-aircraft system that was, quite simply, superior to the kamikaze tactic in every measurable way. The kamikaze pilots of 1945 were brave men, willing to die for their country. But courage cannot defeat physics. Determination cannot overcome mathematics. The Mark 37 director, the Mark I a computer, and the VT proximity fuse represented a level of technological sophistication that Japan could not match. The radar saw through darkness and clouds. The computer calculated faster than any human. The fuse detonated with perfect timing. The Japanese pilots never expected guns that could see the invisible, think the unthinkable, and kill with mathematical precision. By the time they understood what they were facing, it was far too late. They were flying into a future where human courage, no matter how great, was insufficient against the cold logic of machines designed for a single purpose: to turn their sacrifice into statistics, their determination into smoke, and their aircraft into falling debris scattered across the Pacific. The radar-guided guns didn't just defeat the kamikaze tactic, they obsoleted it. They proved that technology, properly applied, could counter even the most fanatical human wave attack. The lesson would echo through the decades that followed, shaping military doctrine in the jet age, the missile age, and beyond. But for the young Japanese pilots diving toward American ships in the spring of 1945, that lesson came too late, written in fire across the sky, one exploding aircraft at a time.